Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 865 for April 5th, 2021. Coming up in a few minutes.
The thing about sustainability is it's not really a one-off thing. It's definitely a journey. It's certainly not the cheapest way to produce whiskey, put it that way.
Scotland's Nc'Nean Distillery won the award for Sustainable Distillery of the Year in Whisky Magazine's 2021 Icons of Whisky Awards last month. The distillery is located on Scotland's remote west coast. Founder Annabel Thomas wanted to use locally available materials as much as possible, along with 100% recycled glass bottles. I'll talk with her later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. That's just ahead, along with the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Your Voice, April's Whiskey Club of the Month, and on Behind the Label.
There's these big double doors, and I knocked on the door, an outside door. I didn't know what to do, and there's a voice shouted, "Come in." So I pressed the latch, it's an old-fashioned latch, and opened the door, closed the door, and slid gingerly behind the door and stood there with a row of faces looking at me, not speaking.
The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast. People never forget the person who introduced them to Redbreast. And then those people go on to introduce others to Redbreast. And soon the flock has grown exponentially. It's like a pyramid scheme. Without any of the bad stuff, of course.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Hey, whiskey fans, I'm Gabriel Cardarella, brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Distillers. You could probably guess I've got a lot of stories. But for me, the good ones have one thing in common. They're best told over a glass of whiskey. So hit pause, grab your bottle of Distillers, and let's get back to this episode of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. Distilleries in Scotland are gradually starting to reopen their visitors' facilities as the Scottish government starts to relax COVID-19 lockdown restrictions. Glen and a handful of other distilleries are reopening their distillery shops as of this week, as restrictions on some so-called non-essential businesses are being eased. However, bars and restaurants will remain closed to both indoor and outdoor service until at least April 26th. Glen said in an email that tours and tastings are scheduled to begin on May 17th. Meanwhile, this week brings the return of major in-person whiskey events in the U.S. As we reported last week, the Whiskey Obsession Festival is set for this Thursday night in Tampa, Florida. That's followed by the Texas Whiskey Festival near Austin on the 16th, and the Nth Universal Whiskey Experience in Las Vegas the following weekend. New COVID cases have been rising in Florida over the last week, while they are dropping slightly in both Texas and Nevada. We should also note that the One Glass Festival at Festivalen in Oslo, Norway, has now been canceled. It had been scheduled for April 16th and 17th. In other news, Northern Kentucky's New Riff Distillery is set for a $2 million expansion project. The Cincinnati Business Courier reports the project will add space for 3 additional fermenters and allow for a 50% increase in annual production. Work is expected to begin as early as next month and be completed by the end of this year. It'll also create several new jobs at the distillery as production expands from 4 to 6 days a week. New Riff founder Ken Lewis told the Courier that he is also looking for property to build another maturation warehouse, since the one they just finished in January will be full within the next 2 years. By the way, several weeks ago we reported on New Riff's 15-year-old bottled in bond charity bourbon that was sold to raise money for hospitality industry workers in the greater Cincinnati area. When it went on sale, every bottle sold out within 15 minutes. They raised $120,000 to help bar and restaurant workers in southwestern Ohio and northern Kentucky. Meanwhile, there is another lawsuit over whiskey brand names and family history in Kentucky. Heaven Hill has filed a lawsuit in federal court over the Dant family's use of its name in connection with the new Dant Crossing development in Gethsemane, Kentucky. Descendants of the original J.W. Dant are about to open Log Still Distillery as part of that project, but Heaven Hill has owned the trademark rights to the J.W. Dant whiskey brand since 1993. Log Still's website claims the Dant descendants are, quote, reviving the Dant family's legacy one barrel at a time. Heaven Hill's lawsuit says that legacy does not need reviving since it belongs to Heaven Hill, and that there is no exception in trademark law for the Dant family members to use that name. The Dants have not yet filed their response to the lawsuit with the U.S. District Court in Louisville. We'll keep you posted. Let's talk about new whiskeys now. And speaking of Heaven Hill, it's releasing the Spring 2021 batch of Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond Bourbon. This season's release is an 8-year-old bourbon that was distilled back in the spring of 2013. It'll sell for around $85 a bottle. Old Forester is out with the first in a new series of bourbons. The 117 series is an experimental range that's being curated by master taster Jackie Zykan. Her first whiskey is being referred to as a High Angels Share bourbon from barrels that lost a lot of whiskey to evaporation in the rickhouse. The 117 refers to the Old Forester Distillery's address on Main Street in downtown Louisville. The 117 series is available there, along with a handful of Kentucky retailers, for $49.99 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. It's not a new release, but the Four Roses Small Batch Select that was first released 2 years ago is getting wider distribution this spring. 12 more states and Washington, D.C. are being added, bringing the total to 29 states and D.C. You'll find my tasting notes for that one at WhiskyCast.com. Turning now to Scotland, where Bruichladdich is trying something new. Well, maybe not quite that new, but it has been a long time since they created a single malt whiskey from the 3 different distillates that go into Bruichladdich, Port Charlotte, and Octomore. The new whiskey is called the Ternary Project, and it was unveiled last Thursday on April Fool's Day. But, as Bruichladdich Adam Hennett told me, it is anything but a joke.
It's a good story, actually. I mean, I suppose in many ways, years ago, we did do this, in the early days of Jim and his kind of creative spirit running wild through the distillery. We did things like 3D3 and whiskies like that in the past, where we were mixing various spirits, and really the ternary idea came from a whiskey I'd made for the masterclass at the Whiskey Festival 2 years back, and just looking at 3 different spirit types, 3 different decades, 3 different everything. Everything was just taking really different whiskies and blending and just going into the warehouse and creating something just for the fun of seeing what something tastes like. So that seed was already there. From what Jim had done before, and then for the masterclass, and then it was actually Alan Logan and I, Alan, the production operations director of the distillery. Him and I were talking about this dram we'd done for the masterclass, and it was just fantastic, And let's he says, can you do some more? And I said, I'll go and do some more and see how much we could create. And but it's just a beautiful dram, and I think that's the great thing that it came from. Just that conversation about it's a great whiskey. Let's go for it. Let's put it out there. So we did. There's a lot of complexity in it. It's a huge dram, but there's some really, really special whiskies in there. You've got kind of 30% of it's old Bruichladdich from back in 1990. It's sherry, really full-bodied. Fantastic sherry cask maturation. Sherry cask maturation. Before that was wine cask. Before that was in Wheatfield Hoggies. We've got some Port Charlotte that again's been through a similar process where we've been blending and creating and just, kind of seeing how that spirit develops in its own right, and the same with the Octomore, and brought them all together. So they're all, you've got a very old Bruichladdich, you've got almost a 20-year-old Port Charlotte, you've got a nice old Octomore in there as well. So I'm really excited to see what people think of it, because the flavour profile is just awesome. It's absolutely incredible.
Now, the timing on this was somewhat suspect, because it was the balloting became available on April 1st. So I have a feeling a lot of folks thought this was an April Fool's prank, and it's not, is it?
It's not an April Fool's prank. No. It's the timing, I think, is just coincidental. I think, like a lot of people, I don't know what day of the week it is anymore. I don't know what's going on these days. Every day is kind of the same, isn't it? So just purely coincidental. It's not a joke.
Because this is the kind of thing we could expect from you guys. This would be something that would not be out of character for Bruichladdich.
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate that, but no, I think we're probably a bit late thinking of an April Fool's joke this year. Obviously, concentrating on releasing the Ternary, but you never know. Next year, we might manage to put something together for next year. See what that could be.
The Ternary project is available exclusively through the Bruichladdich website. We did have at least one April Fool's whiskey release. The Whiskey Exchange released a Speyside single malt last Thursday for online sales, priced at £150 a bottle, with a label reading, quote, "Extremely young. I wish I were older." Well, that was the visible part of the label. Holding it under an ultraviolet light reveals the hidden text. It's actually 30 years old. It is sold out now, and that is no joke. Loch Lomond Distillers is releasing the oldest Little Mill single malt on record. Testament is a 45-year-old whiskey distilled on October 4th, 1976. It was recast into American oak hogsheads in 1996, then received a final 4 months in first fill Oloroso sherry hogsheads. Just 250 decanters are available at a recommended retail price of £8,000 each. The stoppers for those decanters are made from sandstone, reclaimed from the original Little Mill Distillery building after the distillery was destroyed in a 1994 fire. Let's combine American and Irish whiskies for a moment now. Stranahan's in Denver is owned by Proximo Spirits, which is the U.S. arm of Beckley, the Beckman family's holding company for its Jose Cuervo tequila and other brands, including Bushmills. And that is where this collaboration comes in. Stranahan's is releasing a limited edition American single malt finished in casks from Bushmills as the first in a new Distillers experimental series. The Bushmills Stranahan's cask is available exclusively at the distillery in Denver for $69.99 a bottle. Speaking of Beckley, there is still no word on the company's plans for the future of the Proper No. 12 Irish whiskey brand. Plans to acquire the remaining 51% of Conor McGregor's Ireborn Spirits are still being worked out, with that deal expected to close in the coming weeks. As we first reported in February, Beckley has declined to confirm whether McGregor will remain as the public face of Proper No. 12 after the deal closes. Terms of that deal have not been released, but the Drinks Business reported this past week that Beckley took out a loan for $150 million to pay for the acquisition. Beckley spokesmen have not responded to our requests for comment. And finally, a couple of weeks ago, Laura Hemme, the distillery manager at Diageo's Roe & Co. distillery in Dublin, was my guest on the podcast, and she talked about her work with master blender Caroline Martin.
Experience is everything with blending, and Caroline is an industry legend. We also knew that she'd worked a little bit with Bushmills in the past, so she had a bit of experience with Irish whiskey, exactly the right lady for the job. And actually her genius brief in terms of the spirit character that we're aiming for at the moment in the distillery for the blends, for the blend, I guess the whiskey we're laying down for the future of the blend, that comes from Caroline. And we're actually chasing two very distinct spirit characters, which we're then obviously fermenting, distilling entirely separately, but marrying up a very specific ratio in the SRWV warehouse vat at the distillery. And that's working with blending before the spirits even left site and before we've even thought about wood. That's what blending is. I mean, blending goes right back to the start of the process. Ultimately, it's and that's what Caroline has lent to it.
We got word this week that Caroline Martin is retiring after 35 years at Diageo. She also worked on blends for Johnny Walker, Bell's, J&B, and the Old Parr Scotch brands during her tenure. She was based at Diageo's Global Technical Centre in Menstrie, Scotland. The company has now named George Harper as Roe & Co.'s new master blender. We send along our thanks and congratulations to Caroline. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. We celebrated a different milestone during Friday night's Happy Hour live webcast. Glen Grant's Dennis Malcolm joined us on the eve of his 60th anniversary in the Scotch whiskey business. You can catch the on-demand replay anytime at the WhiskyCast YouTube channel. Join us for this week's live webcast on Friday at 5 p.m. New York time, 10 p.m. London time, and 2100 GMT on YouTube, our Facebook page, Twitter, and Twitch. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling. Let's start off with a couple of the virtual events kicking off later this month. The second annual OurWhiskey.com Virtual Festival begins April 29th with weekly online events through May 27th. And the Spirit of Toronto Festival's 2021 Discovery Series has 13 different online tastings scheduled between April 30th and May 16th. While the physical Spirit of Speyside Whiskey Festival has been postponed until November, there will be virtual Spirit of Speyside events online between April 29th and May 2nd. Elsewhere, Druitt's has its next auction of rare spirits and wines in Donington Priory, England, April 29th, while McTeer's has its next auction May 7th in Glasgow, Scotland. The Whiskey Show Sydney is still on the calendar for May 14th and 15th in Australia, along with Whiskey Live Canberra on May 28th and 29th. That same weekend is the rescheduled Bergen Whiskey and Beer Festival in Bergen, Norway, and as of now, the National Whiskey Festival is still on for June 5th in Edinburgh, Scotland. Remember, all in-person events are still subject to change on short notice, depending on changes in local public health restrictions. Make sure you check with event organizers before you make any travel plans. We do update the calendar at the WhiskyCast website all week long as we get updates on event changes and details on new events. The calendar of events is brought to you by Catoctin Creek Distilling, makers of the Virginia Rye Whiskey. You'll find their Roundstone Rye at fine whiskey shops in 26 U.S. states, 3 continents, and online. Visit the Where to Buy page at catoctincreekdistilling.com to find a retailer near you. And please drink responsibly.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Gabriel Cardarella again, the Doers guy. I've seen a lot in my years as brand ambassador for the world's most awarded blended scotch. Like the time I got a hold of an actual letter written by Andrew Carnegie, a letter from 1891, in it asking Doers to ship a keg of whiskey to President Benjamin Harrison at the White House. Spoiler alert, we did. And the bourbon folks were not too happy about it. Pretty cool, right? Well, here's another story for you. In 2019, our master blender, Stephanie McLeod, became the first woman to be awarded Master Blender of the Year by the International Whiskey Competition. And a year after that, she won it again. Stephanie's first creation for Dewar's 15 year, is another piece of history. Sweet, floral, with notes of honey and toffee, a perfectly balanced addition to the Dewar's lineup. It's a great introduction to Scotch for beginners, and it's more than complex enough to satisfy whiskey aficionados. So grab some Dewar's 15, call some friends, and make a few stories of your own. That's what a good bottle of whiskey is all about.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by the Distillers Edition collection. Distilleries are focusing more and more on sustainability, not just to keep regulators off their backs, but because it makes economic sense to ensure the long-term viability of their businesses. The other day, Whisky Magazine handed out its annual Icons of Whisky Awards, and Scotland's Nc'Nean Distillery was named Sustainable Distillery of the Year. The short list of finalists also included Fuse Spirits just outside of Chicago, Illinois, Sweden's Mackmyra Distillery, Glendalough Distillery in Ireland, and the Lord Byron Distillery in Australia. Annabel Thomas opened Nc'Nean on her family's farm near Drimnin, Scotland in 2017, and bottled the distillery's first single malt last year. I talked with her on Zoom the other day, and the voice you'll hear from time to time in the background is her husband Hugh, who, like Annabel, has been working from home during the pandemic. This has to be a big honor for you and something you got to be really proud of.
It was. It's absolutely amazing. It was not expected, I guess, but what a great endorsement of all of the efforts we've put into that over the last 3 to 4 years, and great to be recognised by such a prestigious award, and to have got the overall world winner is pretty great.
So tell us what you did with the distillery in designing it to make it sustainable.
Well, I guess the thing about sustainability is it's not really a one-off thing. It's definitely a journey. So there were a few things that we did in the very early stages when we were building it, and then it's kind of a continual iteration, and nobody's perfect. But the key things that we did up front were make sure it's all powered by renewable energy. So that was part of the design process, I guess. We're lucky, well, we're both lucky and unlucky to be in a very remote location, which means that we can source timber locally and operate off a biomass boiler. So for us, that's by far the most environmentally friendly solution in that location. We also source 100% organic Scottish barley. And that is really for us less about carbon footprint, but more about biodiversity in the farms that, we source from. And then the third thing was, I guess the third and fourth things are water and waste. They're kind of less thought about in terms of sustainability sometimes because a lot of people focus on carbon footprint. But we recycle, so most of the water that's used in a whiskey distillery is for the condensers, not actually for the whiskey. And we have, I think, one off in Scotland, which is a cooling pond, which we recycle through continuously. So we cool the water just through natural evaporation, and we just have one tiny pump that pumps it back to the distillery. And we are also a zero waste distillery. So it means we send, I think it's less than 99.9% of our waste to landfill, which is great.
Obviously, this had to be designed from the ground up with sustainability in mind. A lot of older distilleries don't have the options that you did in a new build to be able to pull off something like this.
Yeah, I think that's a huge advantage that we had, was that you can design it in from the beginning as long as you're clear on your intent. You're spending that capital anyway to build the distillery, and you can now choose which way to go. And I think it is really hard for older distilleries who need to retrofit or think about replacing a perfectly good oil boiler with something that's going to be significantly more expensive and things. So yeah, I think we're very lucky from that point of view.
Was wind power an option at all? I know it can get pretty windy on the west coast of Scotland, and it seems like windmills might have been a good option.
Well, we did consider that. There's a number of challenges with wind power. One is that actually the turbines are a little bit ugly. The second is that a distillery, when it needs power, it needs power. You have shift pattern. We work one shift a day. The distillery runs from 8 till 5. And if the wind's not blowing, you've got a bit of a problem. And that's not a very easy way to run effectively a manufacturing process. So the battery technology is not really there yet. And also the conversion of electricity, which is effectively what wind power generates, into steam is also not hugely efficient at the moment. So we have considered it at times for more for our electrical needs than for the vast majority of the energy we use.
What else can you do to improve sustainability? It sounds like you've pretty much taken this as far as you can go, but I suspect that there are other things you can probably do.
Well, it's a very interesting question. We're actually just going through our first carbon footprinting process at the moment, which is kind of the next step on our journey, if you like. And basically what that shows, so carbon footprinting is divided into these buckets of where your carbon footprint comes from. And at a high level, what that shows is that our carbon footprint of what we do at the distillery is very, very low. And our ability to make that lower is limited. Doesn't mean we'll stop trying, but it is relatively limited. But the carbon footprint of everything you buy in is where it all sits. And that's really our focus. So the first step on that was to look at our glass bottles for the actual whiskey. Packaging is notoriously carbon intensive, and it is a real conundrum for producers of premium spirits and premium products in any form. So we were really lucky when we were going through that design process that we found this 100% recycled glass bottle, which saves 40% of the carbon footprint of a virgin glass bottle. And we have done things like make gift boxes optional to try and discourage people from using those as well. But it's really in that side that we're now going to look more, which is how can we work with suppliers to just continuously reduce that footprint. It might be reducing the transport miles on our malt. We're looking at things like refills for whiskey bottles so that we can send out a glass bottle first, but then send something with a much lower carbon footprint the second time.
That's been a question I've had about bottles for a long time with the carbon footprint, because a lot of the carbon that's used in those is not only in the making of the glass, but in shipping empty glass bottles all over from mainland Europe, from China, wherever you're sourcing them. That's a lot of heavy glass that's being shipped around the world, especially when you're shipping exported bottles that have to be filled in Scotland.
Absolutely. And there's also issues in the mining of the raw materials in the first place if you're using virgin glass. So you're mining the sand. It then takes a lot of energy to break that down. More energy if it's sand than if it's recycled. But again, it still takes energy to break recycled glass down. And then you've got to get them to the facility. And as you say, it all has to be done in Scotland, which is another challenge we will sort of gradually start working on in the next few years, which is that in many instances, it would be much better for the environment for us to ship in bulk. And that obviously isn't allowed at the moment in Scotland. And I think that's something that the industry probably needs to look at. You know, some of our distributors will decant into, tiny sample bottles so that they can give one to every retailer. And they're doing that from glass bottles. It's complete madness. So starting to address things like that is also kind of on our priority list.
How much does this sustainability focus add to the cost of your whiskeys down the road to the consumer? Obviously, somebody's got to pay for this down the road. And I think it's people like us.
Good question. It depends. It depends on which aspect we're talking about. The glass bottle piece actually doesn't add to the cost. And where we offer, for example, optional gift boxes, we pass all of that saving on to the consumer. But on the other hand, organic barley is more expensive. There's no denying it. It's 60% at least, depends a little bit on the year, but more expensive than standard barley. And that's probably the main one. Operating a biomass boiler is a bit swings and roundabouts. The upfront capital investment is enormous. We spent about £500,000 on the boiler versus you should probably spend 100,000 on an oil boiler. But the actual cost of operating it is much more stable and attractive than an oil boiler. So it's kind of swings and roundabouts. What we would be charging if it wasn't organic, I don't know, because I've never done that calculation. But it's certainly not the cheapest way to produce whiskey, put it that way.
What about anaerobic digestion for your biomass, the draft, and other things? Are you trying that? I know other distilleries have done it in the past and then taken the plants out when they needed to be retrofitted because it wasn't generating what they thought it would in terms of cost savings and carbon savings.
Exactly. Well, we have looked at that, but not very in depth. One of the, I suppose, the benefit of being new is that you can put stuff in at the beginning, but the disadvantage of being small is that a lot of this technology is actually poorly suited at our scale. So most of the anaerobic digestion plants that have been designed for work in existing distilleries are absolutely enormous compared to what we would need. So at the moment, that's not a viable option for us, but it's something we'll continue assessing, because that's the thing. As the whole world goes on this sustainability journey, technology moves very quickly. So maybe that's something we can introduce in the future.
We haven't had the chance to talk about Nc'Nean before, although I did talk with your architects a little over a year ago when we were talking about distillery architecture. And he cited your project as one of his favorite ones. But why did you decide to build a distillery in the first place? Give us the Nc'Nean origin story.
I like that story about the architects because it's a very beautiful place, but it's a total nightmare to do a building project. So I'm glad you still looked back on it so fondly. Why did we decide to do it? So it was a very long running, I guess, development. So it's on my family's farm. That was the original genesis of the idea. It's a beautiful location on the West Coast. You can't really be there without thinking about whiskey. But I was working in a corporate job in London at the time. It was something we floated around as a family. And I really got into it or involved in it in 2012 when I took some time off from my previous job and just sort of volunteered some of my time to the family project, to the distillery, and started really thinking about it in detail. And that was when I kind of realized that I felt there wasn't enough focus on sustainability or other forms of creativity around the spirit that was being made, as I personally would have wanted to see in Scotch. And I think there's an amazing role for tradition, and the existing distilleries are doing that brilliantly, but there's also a role for new distilleries to come and do things a bit differently. So that was the kind of genesis of the idea on my side, I guess. We thought it was going to be really easy. Turned out not to be. So eventually the following year, I left my job in 2013 to focus on it more full time. And it took us 4 years to raise the funding and build it. And we've been producing since 2017.
And your first whiskey sold for something like £90,000 in a charity auction. Did that shock you when that happened?
Yes, definitely. It shocked everybody. So this was last August. The reason we did the charity auction is because it's been a very strange year for everybody, obviously, but we've known that 2020 is our launch year for 3 years, and suddenly you're looking at launching in COVID, and we just felt like it would be nice, given the position the world was in, to give something back at the same time as launching. So that's how we came up with this charity auction idea. We picked our 5 charities. We told them that we thought the auction would raise about £20,000. And they'd all get a fifth of that. And then basically they ended up getting £20,000 each. Absolutely amazing. It didn't even cross our minds that we would raise that much money, but sometimes you just capture the zeitgeist or get lucky or whatever it is.
I think people want to get their hands on the first bottle from a new distillery just for an investment, or just to say, yeah, I got their first bottle as bragging rights.
Absolutely. And we were also lucky that there were 2 people who wanted to do that, which in an auction situation pushes things up a bit. And I think, I think other people felt the same as us as well, which is it was a nice time to feel like you were giving to charity as well.
For those of us who have not tasted Nc'Nean single malt, explain what it tastes like. What's the profile?
Well, we've always been aiming for something relatively light and fruity. It is a mixture of STR casks and bourbon barrels. So if you're familiar with STR casks, that's a very good indication of some of the taste profile. And then it's 65% STR and then 35% bourbon, which gives it this lovely vanilla-iness. So we describe it as stone fruits and spice. But I think the other interesting thing about it is it's got very good body and texture, which we wonder whether comes actually from the organic barley. Because it's not something we see so much in other whiskies, even that have used STR or a similar cask mix. And we don't make anything without organic barley, so we'll never know, but that's our interpretation of it.
STR casks are the creation of the legendary and late Dr. Jim Swan. Did he work with you on this project? Is that where you got the inspiration?
Absolutely, yes. And very sadly, he died 2 weeks before our first spirit run. So that was pretty devastating at the time. We commissioned and started distilling in March 2017, and he died in February. So it was a pretty tough time for everybody. He'd been working with us since 2012, so he'd helped design all of the spirit recipes that we put through the distillery and also the cask sourcing. So,
give me your best Jim Swan story.
My best Jim Swan story. God, which one? My favourite memory of him is just what a kind of huge source of knowledge he was. He came up to the distillery probably 2 weeks before he died, by which point we had originally hoped that we would be commissioning, but weren't, obviously, because all these things always take absolutely ages. But by that point, our distillery manager, Gordon, who's still our distillery manager now, was on site and ready to go. So Jim was always very reluctant to write things down, and he'd much rather just do or see or tell. Anyway, we had him coming up and everything was organised. So we said, please, can you come up anyway and you can meet Gordon and we can start talking about stuff. And we just spent the whole day mining his brain for information and doing all the planning and so on and so forth, which had turned out to be an enormously good thing because we never saw him again. And we had spent, 5 years working with him, and you kind of always assume, well, we'll get to that point when we get to it. So what didn't seem like a very special day at the time turned out to be the most important day I'd ever spent with Jim in the whole period.
Did he leave behind any notes at all for you? I know that Ian Chang at Cavalan got some of his notes that he had written down over the years on their distillery.
No, but I wrote everything down that day. I don't know what possessed me, but I just felt like I just wanted to get everything out of his brain. So I have, I think, 4 pages of typed up notes from everything he said that day, which is our only reference point. And it was very sad last year, I felt, when we were putting the whiskey together, because, in between times, we probably wouldn't have been working that closely with him because you're just waiting for the spirit to mature and seeing how it goes. But that point where we were deciding what proportion of STR and what proportion of bourbon to use would have been, he would have been so instrumental in that. But we just had to go with our gut and see what we felt best without his input, which was a very sad moment.
Let's go from talking about a passing to another transition. Your transition, because by the time this interview airs, you will be a mom.
Well, I am actually already a mum.
Okay.
So I would just be a mum to 2. Yes.
Okay. At this point, you're outnumbered.
Correct. Correct, sadly.
What do you hope to teach your kids about the business, and do you hope they'll take over for you someday?
Well, at the moment, I'm just very proud of the fact that if my 3-year-old daughter sees our whiskey bottle in a magazine or something, she can say, "Mummy's whiskey." Like, yes.
That's going to cause problems at preschool later on.
I know. Like,
my grandson, my grandson was known in preschool and kindergarten to talk about Papa drinks whiskey all the time, and referred to my Glencairn glasses as Papa's sippy cups.
I love it.
So that's what you're in for.
Exactly. So I'm a great believer in not trying to put too much pressure on kids as to what they should be when they grow up. So who knows where things will be when she's even old enough to drink the whiskey. But I guess it's, it is a family business, albeit that we have lots of external investors as well. So I hope to some extent she'll be involved in it, but I definitely am not aspiring for her to take it over at any point. I think that's too much pressure to lump on a child, probably.
But there are some parallels between parenting and making whiskey. They both take a long time, and you're never quite done with the process.
Definitely. Definitely. And in fact, I think starting a business and having children, right, it's the highs and the lows and the emotional investment and the fact that you can never really take a break from either of them. So, yeah, absolutely. It's a very good parallel.
What do you see Nc'Nean looking like 10 years from now?
Well, I hope that we will be well known, well, better known than we are now, because we're only just starting out at the moment. But I also hope that we will have created some really super interesting whiskies, and that we will really have pushed the industry ourselves, but as a result also the industry, to take some really big step changes on sustainability, and hopefully we'll still be leading the way on that. Yeah, I think that's about all I can hope for.
By the way, Annabel and Hugh are still waiting for baby number 2 to arrive. As I'm recording this episode, we'll keep you posted. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by the Distillers Edition collection lineup of single malts from Diageo's Classic Malts. Look for the new editions of Oban, Talisker, Lagavulin, Cragganmore, Dalwhinnie, and Glenkinchie at a whiskey shop near you. Get all the details at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's begin with the Old Forester 117 series High Angels Share Bourbon that I mentioned during the news. It's bottled at 55% ABV, and the nose has notes of caramel, toasted vanilla, charred oak, brown sugar, and a hint of old leather, while hints of dried fruits come out slowly with some time in the glass. The taste is peppery, with a hint of cinnamon on top of brown sugar, toasted vanilla, caramel candy, and dried fruits. The finish is long and well-balanced between lingering spices and a nice sweetness. I'm scoring the debut release in the Old Forester 117 series a 92. Next up, the Highland Park single cask I mentioned last week that's been bottled in collaboration with the guys behind the Scotch in the City Instagram account for charity. It's bottled at 65.4% ABV. The nose has notes of butterscotch, caramel, a hint of peat smoke, and touches of oak, subtle spices, and dried flowers. The taste is spicy, with hints of black pepper and allspice, along with a bit of peat smoke, and touches of caramel, butterscotch, red apples, and just a hint of honey. The finish is long and well-balanced with just a hint of smoke. I'm scoring the Highland Park Scotch in the City single cask a 91. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Want to find out just how Sagamore Spirit is reviving and evolving the tradition of Maryland-style rye whiskey, including its new tequila cask-finished rye. In-person tastings are available once again now at the distillery in Baltimore, but you'll also find a variety of virtual tours, tastings, and other experiences at the Sagamore Spirit website. They're offering WhiskyCast listeners a free virtual guided tasting. If you buy bottles from your local retailer, a Sagamore Spirit teammate will guide you through each product. Visit sagamorespirit.com and use the code WhiskyCast, all one word, to access. Please drink responsibly. We've talked before about Westland Distillery's work with peated malt, and while that whiskey is still maturing in Seattle, Copperworks Distillery nearby has released its own peated American single malt. It's made with Skagit Valley barley from Washington that was dried with peat from a bog on the Olympic Peninsula, then matured for 49 months. It's bottled at 52% ABV. The nose has a subtle smokiness with notes of roasted almonds, toasted wood, honey, vanilla, and subtle spices. Those spices come alive on the palate and complement touches of campfire smoke, almond oil, cedar chips, sea salt, and honey. The finish is long with a gentle smokiness and a touch of garden soil, along with hints of smoked salmon and honey. I'm scoring the Copperworks peated malt whiskey a 92. Now, back in January, I reported on the launch of Coalition Rye Whiskey. It's a collaboration between former Russian Standard USA CEO Leonid Yangarber, Kentucky Artisan Distillery owner Steve Thompson, and wine industry veteran Ludwig Vaneron. I received samples of both their barrel-proof rye and their Margaux Wine Barriques finish rye recently. Let's focus on that second one now. The whiskey comes from Kentucky Artisan, and it's bottled at 45.4% ABV. The nose has notes of plums, raisins, and berry cobbler, along with hints of oak, baking spices, and a subtle touch of dill in the background. The taste starts off soft and fruity at first, followed by a nice burst of baking spices that does not overwhelm the fruitiness. That's a good point. The spices fade to a dry taste along with hints of berry cobbler and honey. The finish medium length with touches of dry spices, berries, and a hint of oak. I'm scoring the Coalition Rye Margaux Barriques finish a 90. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of nearly 3,100 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
It's time to announce our latest Whiskey Club of the Month now. And this month we're honoring the Bourbon Honey Hole in Houston, Texas. Tony Marchant sent this email to nominate his club. We're thawing out and have survived the snowpocalypse of 2021. It feels a little weird nominating yourself, but who else is going to do it? Started in 2020, the Bourbon Honey Hole is a fine blend of people from all over the world, centrally located in Houston, Texas. We specialize in helping new bourbon enthusiasts learn about the history of distilleries and those key individuals who make the brands we love. Thank you all for the contest and especially all the helpful content that you provide. You're the best. Well, thanks for that, Tony, and flattering the host is not necessary, but we are going to send you and your friends 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses to use at your club tastings. Congratulations, Tony. Now, if you're in a whiskey club and would like to nominate your club for Whiskey Club of the Month honors, all you have to do is do just like Tony did and use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com. Tell us a bit about your club, and if you have a website or a social media presence, we'll be glad to add a link on our Whiskey Clubs page at the WhiskyCast website. Once again, congratulations to the Bourbon Honey Hole in Houston, Texas, our latest Whiskey Club of the Month, and thanks to Glencairn Crystal for helping us support whiskey clubs around the world. Let's open up the inbox now for your voice. Heard from some folks following a discussion on Reddit the other day. Someone spotted a difference between bottlings of Glendronach 12-year-old, in which the reference to non-chill filtered was missing on the canister label of one. Well, that immediately started a bunch of complaints among Redditors, and some found their way to me. When that happens, I go straight to the source, in this case, Rachel Berry, the master blender for Glendronach. She assured me via email that there has been no change in production methods for the Glendronach 12. Last week, I followed our WhiskyCast In-Depth interview with Dave Sweet of the Whiskey Obsession Festival with my own personal thoughts on why I'm not comfortable returning to in-person whiskey shows just quite yet. Scott Rogers in Wisconsin, at @RScottRogers on Twitter, responded with this. Thanks for following your main interview with your own thoughts on when you'll feel comfortable attending events and why. We all need to speak and hear such statements. Most of us are cautious. That's okay, and it's important for that majority voice to be heard. Well, Scott, I'm not sure if I'm in the majority or not. All I can do is take responsibility for my own actions and encourage everyone else to do the same. But thank you for the kind words. If there's something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all those other things that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. This time we're going to look at some history. From 60 years ago this week, to be specific. That's because on April 3rd, 1961, 15-year-old Dennis Malcolm reported to his first day on the job at Glen Distillery in Rothes, Scotland. Dennis celebrated his 60th anniversary in the business this weekend and joined us on Friday night's Happy Hour live webcast. He was literally born at the distillery's main gate and told us about that first day of work 15 years later.
Maybe the reason for that was I wasn't very bright to go on to further education, so I decided to go into the distillery, but that's not exactly true. My father worked at Glen Grant and my grandfather before that, and the owner at the time when I started was Douglas McKessick, and he said that if any employee had children who are about to leave school, boys or girls, there was an opportunity at the distillery, they would be considered. So that's how I started at the distillery, and I really wanted to be a cooper, The first day I'll never forget, in these days you had to buy your overalls and your boots and your 3-foot roll and your tools of the trade, really. And I walked up to the distillery, to the cooperage, which was beside the boardroom. You've been at Glen Grant, Mark, so you'll know there's a little garden there. That's where the cooperage was. And there's these big double doors. And I knocked on the door, an outside door. I didn't know what to do. And there's a voice shouted, "Come in." So I pressed the latch, it's an old-fashioned latch, and opened the door, closed the door, and slid gingerly behind the door and stood there at a row of faces looking at me, not speaking. I had to wait for quite a while till the head cooper appeared to get me going.
Of course, health and safety laws would stop a 15-year-old from going to work at a distillery today. Once again, congratulations to Dennis Malcolm on his 60th anniversary. You can watch the entire interview at the WhiskyCast YouTube channel. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot. The tears of Ireland's great writers bursting with flavour, humour and angst. Bottled for you to taste. No writers were harmed in the making of this premium Irish whiskey. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes all the way back to 2005. We love to hear from you. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments@whiskycast.com.
At Doers, we love a good story, and that's why we're always writing new chapters. Like our Illegal Smooth finished in mezcal casks, with notes of sliced green pepper and a wisp of smoke. A world's first, Illegal brings cultures together for something truly unique. As a 174-year-old brand, we could rest on our laurels. Instead, we'd much rather continue writing. Because when you keep telling the same old story, that's when people stop listening.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever go out drinking with a peacock? Always the same. Few too many, tail feathers come out, drinks get knocked over, bartender's not happy, night's over before it started. All I'm saying is, don't be the peacock in your group.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2021, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening, and please stay safe.